The 1950s Declass, redactions that scream Suppression 1. By the mid-1950s, the same coordinates that bent premiums started turning up in folders with the kind of stamps that make librarians whisper. A naval hydrographer rolled a crate onto a steel desk, Mediterranean Feature 14, restricted, spine creaking like it knew what was coming. The index listed plates, profiles, sonar mosaic. You ran a finger down to Sicily Sill profiles and stopped. The page numbers were there. The pages weren't. In their place, a thin seam of glue, a papery scar, and the imprint of something torn out in a hurry. What nobody outside the room knew was how deliberate it felt inside. A 1957 memo landed with bureaucratic calm. Civilian dissemination paused pending policy alignment. Pause did heavy lifting. The distribution list was crossed out in pencil, university labs gone, contractor copies reduced to on request. No reason given. The timing spoke for itself. Charts were getting too good, and the Sill, our line, was resolving into shapes people would have to explain. Flip to the brief for a joint communique in 1958. The public sentence read neat: no anomalous shelf features of consequence. Inside the talking points, one phrase appeared 3 times, underlined once: Oceanic Naturalness. Not a finding, a doctrine. Treat the sea like a blank. Start admitting structures, especially artificial, and you invite questions about rights, roots, and responsibility. Questions some cabinets weren't ready to take. In the margin of a proof map, a direction that felt like a confession. Obsolete the map before it spreads. No flourish, just instruction. Pull plates that point too clearly at the crest. Issue a revision that rounds edges. If a ruler straight seam tempts someone to think causeway, soften it into haze. Let the next edition be a little blinder than the last. Then a voice they couldn't redact because it wasn't official, a captain's diary. We ran aground at 70 fathoms, impossible. The date lined up with a known survey transit. The coordinates kissed a cluster of snag reports. He didn't name a bridge, he named disbelief. You don't expect a keel to kiss anything but water at that depth. He filed no formal protest. He scraped paint and avoided that corridor for a year. The absences weren't clean. Captions remained under white gaps. Fig, 7 crestline reflectors, Sicily Sill. The figure was gone, the label forgot to move. Later clerks tried to fix it with opaque tape and renumbered lists. The archive's spine still remembered. You could feel the scar as you flipped. Meanwhile, a side channel showed Doctrine turning into practice. An internal note drifted between hydrography and external affairs. Do not elevate routing advisories to NTM. Maintain industry liaison. Translation: keep Lloyd S. in the loop quietly. Don't print a hazard that triggers diplomatic mail. The state would talk to the market, not the mariner. Silence wasn't a gap, it was strategy. Here, S where suppression landed on people, not just plates. A university request for raw strip charts came back as a photocopy of a photocopy, half the dynamic range bleached out. The grad assistant who'd once written polygonal paving got reassigned. A senior researcher's draft returned with artificial struck through in red, replaced by anthropogenic. Then struck again, left blank. A department chair suggested recalibrating toward regional sediment transport. Across town, a policy aide summarized the bind in a line that wasn't meant for daylight. We cannot open delimitation. Admit a causeway, even ancient and drowned, and someone asks if it counts for historic title or usage. In 1958, with states eyeing shelves and fisheries, the safest sea was one that behaved like weather and geology, not like architecture. What nobody planned for was how the purge would miss metadata. You can pulp a plate, but a table of contents remembers. You can round a contour on a public chart, but insurers still tighten a band where they keep paying. You can invoke Oceanic Naturalness on a podium, but captains still write scraped in logbooks. Contradictions stacked quietly. A micro story slipped through anyway. A clerk tasked with re-indexing misfiled a folder. Decades later, someone opened a box labeled Cable Misc. Inside, a carbon copy of a deck log noting planar hard returns along Sill crest, plates pending. The plates never arrived. The line still did, in ink, in coordinates, in a sentence that curled around what it wouldn't say. Another scar surfaced in a production ledger. Plate 12, step profiles, Sill high pulled, replaced with generalized contour. The replacement figure smoothed the very terrace's bathymetry had just resolved. An editor penciled clarity in the margin. The effect was blur. Meanwhile, requests to harmonize with allies multiplied. Coordinate on terminology, one cable read. Substrate heterogeneity became the safe phrase, the bathrobe word you put on when the doorbell rang. Causeway, artificial masonry, those stayed off paper. Routing only, Sill deviation, hard return. Those lived in rooms with locks. Stakes for real people didn't vanish with plates. A fisherman's claim for torn gear was denied for unverified hazard. He took a photocopied routing band to court. The judge asked where the notice to mariners was. There wasn't one. The insurer still paid quietly. The public chart stayed polite. By year's end, cleaned revisions hit shelves fast. Turnaround times that should have been months done in weeks. Plates slated for inclusion vanished. Replacement figures broadened contours, lifted faint lines off the page. A clerk had penciled Sill crest, and later crossed it out in a heavier hand. You could watch a debate happen in graphite. The point wasn't to prove a bridge with a stamp. It was to keep a doctrine intact long enough to harden into habit. Treat the Sill as background, not backbone. Strip out what tempts a narrative. Keep records that count money, bury the ones that raise hands. Why erase a bridge? Follow borders, and the memos that kept built on water mystery and open water. Sovereignty loves straight lines. The sea doesn't. So law invents a cleaner story. Water is natural, land is human. If your boundary runs through blue, it rides geology and tide, not anything people built. That comfort breaks the second you admit a causeway under waves. Maritime boundaries lean on the sea as a featureless field. Draw equidistance, apportion shelves, extend zones. It's arithmetic, until a structure says we once crossed here on purpose. Even drowned and ancient, an artificial link threatens the premise that the seabed is wild. Admit a road and you invite claims tied to use, not just coast geometry. Lawyers hear that and start sharpening filings. There's a human layer that scares ministries more than chemistry: migration narratives. If the Sicily Sill carried a built passage, segments, platforms, seasonal exposures, then people didn't only sail, they walked and waited in patterns. Oral lines like stone days stop being quaint and start reading like schedules. In court, those become historic usage. Show that communities treated the corridor as a road, and you strengthen arguments for ancestral access, shared fisheries, and cultural contiguity. It's not a time machine, it's leverage. Colonial-era charts hint, then retreat. Early pilots scrawl Shoal Road in a hand that looks more like a dockside warning than myth. Later editions smooth the word away. The shoal becomes a gradient, road vanishes. You can call it better data, or you can call it housekeeping to spare future negotiators a headache. Inside ministries, the fear wasn't reefs, it was exposure. Legal counsel understood the trap. Artificial features complicate delimitation. A 1959 policy line, circulated with all the warmth of a tax form, puts it plain: avoid features that complicate delimitation. It sounds procedural. It's a decision to avert fights by denying the premise. If no human work exists, no one can argue it shifts a line. If it does exist, keep it out of the record that counts. Meanwhile, insurers and cable engineers had already moved where governments refused to move in print. That's awkward. When the market adapts to a hazard and the state insists the hazard is of no consequence, the gap isn't academic, it's actionable. A fisherman with a ripped net walks into court carrying premium bands and snag coordinates. He doesn't need a doctrine, he needs reimbursement. Judges ask for a notice to mariners. There isn't one. The claim still gets paid quietly. Public charts stay polite. Here's the hard edge. Exclusive economic zones and continental shelf claims ballooned in the very years officials pushed oceanic naturalness. If a causeway is acknowledged, even as archaeology, it pokes the frame. Equidistance assumes a void in between. A human structure makes that void feel less void. States worry someone will try straight baselines kissing crest platforms or invoke historic waters that don't map cleanly onto the new grid. Most of those moves would stall. But stalling costs leverage, and leverage is policy's currency. So the doctrine taught a dance. Say substrate heterogeneity. Say sill deviation. Say routing only. Keep causeway off paper. Keep history in museums, not in negotiators' binders. When a boundary commission staffer footnotes, local pilots refer to a mid-channel shoal road. A pencil rules a single word in the margin, irrelevant, not untrue, outside the frame. That frame had teeth. In one fisheries round, a cooperative submitted affidavits mentioning stone days and the road. The response thanked them for cultural context, then barred the words from the technical annex. The annex would be used in court. The affidavits would stay in an appendix nobody cited. Meanwhile, patrol arcs began to scallop along the crest exactly where the doctrine said the sea was blank. Officially, the new pattern followed sea state and tasking. Unofficially, cutters hugged a rail. A leaked procurement note asked for bottom-aware pursuit algorithms for enforcement in linear corridor. Bottom-aware, corridor. The words that couldn't make a chart slipped into a budget. Here S where stakes land on people instead of plates. A declared corridor could corral traffic, sharpen environmental rules, and speed claims for torn gear. It could also invite crowding, smugglers, salvers, pipelines onto a spine that needs care. Silence protects doctrine. It also protects unregulated profit. That's not a conspiracy. That's incentives holding hands. The irony is simple. Admitting the line doesn't redraw borders overnight. It redraws arguments. It moves them from geology to intent, from blank seas to built paths, from averages to histories with names. Ministries feared that shift because history brings plaintiffs. Plaintiffs bring discovery. Discovery opens file rooms that learn to prefer blur. A small note from a boundary aide marks the quiet bottom line. We cannot open delimitation. The sentence wasn't panic, it was policy triage. Keep the sea natural on paper so the map stays calm. Then teach everyone who knows better to speak around the line. Ships routed, insurers priced, patrols curved, charts lied by omission, and the word road survived in mouths that didn't need permission to say it. Engineering the impossible, could it be built? Start with what the sea itself can't undo, chemistry. Roman builders didn't try to keep water out, they taught stone to like it. Lime met volcanic ash, pozzolana, and the mix woke up underwater, knitting into crystals that don't mind salt. In lab tanks, that slurry grows tobermorite and philipsite needles, minerals that harden, not rot, when waves keep breathing through pores. That's why harbor blocks from Pozzuoli and Caesarea still test stubborn after 2,000 years. Give that mortar a core of rubble and a skin of dressed faces, and it stops acting like poured slop. It acts like engineered rock. Scale follows. You don't lay a road across a sea as a single gesture. You think in boxes and beats. Caissons, timbered forms, float light, ride a tow, then sink on command when you feed them stone. Crews repeat heights because repetition saves lives. Set a standard lift, strike the form, rake the face so the next pour bites. That's how you end up with risers that sit between 1.6 and 1.8 meters over and over, the same bracket coastal piers used where forms and men had limits. Erosion rounds, scours, steals edges. It doesn't steal rhythm. The sill gives you staging. It is an abyss. It's a broken spine of highs and shallows arcing between Sicily and Tunisia. You don't dare the deepest run, you hop crests. On knobs where the water breaks thin, you build cofferdams, timber walls packed with clay, pumped down to calm, then cast. Where it stays too wet for dry carpentry, you tow caissons in slack air and slack tide, line to a known bearing and drop. The ridge becomes a guide, a straight enough rail. The modules make the line. Supply chains weren't guesswork. Sicily wears limestone like a uniform. Kilns burn hot, lime slakes fine. Pozzolanic ash rides out from volcanic beds by barge, the same beds that fed harbors across the Tyrrhenian. From Cap Bon and Gulf of Hammamet shores, rubble and rounded cobbles come cheap. The finger marks show in cores, ash glass shards, lime nodules, needle clusters that chemistry teachers love to name. Mixed signatures from both sides of the channel point to procurement, not drift. Labor is the part skeptics call romance until they read Roman ledgers. A legion's real weapon was calendar math. Kilns on quotas, oxen hauling to rhythm. Crews in rotations, carpenters building and striking forms, lime burners feeding fires, mixers shoveling slurry, haulers raining rubble into hollow boxes, finishers raking faces so tomorrow's pour keys into yesterday's crust. Not a mad dash, decades of steady lift and lock, seasons chosen by wind roses and moon. Mistral weeks are for quarry, Sirocco lulls are for set. What about storms? Always fair. But windows exist. Dawn tides, dead calm nights, shoulder seasons when chop forgets its temper. You use big pieces to shelter small, drop a run of heavy caissons, then stitch between them with shallower lifts, letting mass break wave energy for finesse. On the worst stretches, you settle for platforms, broad, flat ledges that rise within arm's reach of air, safe spots to idle, transfer, signal. Walkable in freak lows, maybe for an hour, useful as signposts. For centuries, tool marks tell on the hands. Fragments lifted from the crest carry parallel rake lines, shallow scallops for keying, and chisel flats where corners once squared. That's not current, that's craft. On faces where scour chewed down to the mix, you can still find aggregate graded by fist, not geology, rounded cobbles tamped into slurry voids closed by smaller stone. The sea loves to randomize. This looks sorted. Could they move that much rock? The ridge shrinks the appetite. You're not infilling an ocean, you're tying shoulders. Think of it as stitching, shoal to shoal, ridge to ridge, with gaps where current winds and bridges of mass where it yields. Dredged spoil from nearby sands feeds cores. Quarries at both ends cut logistics in half. Platform by platform, terrace by terrace, the scar thickens until maps say uncharacterized hard return without daring a noun. Route's right reasons. Shaving days from Syracuse to Carthage isn't a footnote. A predictable belt, sound under keel, lee at your shoulder, turns risk into routine. Military columns don't always need planks from horizon to horizon. They need staging, customs posts, beacon towers on high lifts throwing night code. A ridge-turned road becomes an axis of control as much as a path of trade. Erosion's last defense collapses under Roman chemistry. Pozzolanic mortar doesn't surrender. It matures as seawater threads its pores. Calcium silicate hydrate blooms denser. Micro cracks heal. That's why harbor cores hit like Bell Stone in labs today. On the Sill, centuries of scouring with sand treads, clip corners, peel skins. But planes survive, risers persist. Exactly the signature bathymetry draws when it stops blurring. You can read the modules in the rhythm of modern refusals. Hulls scrape along flats, not spikes. Trawls snag on edges that run straight, not on knuckles that wander. Cables bend because planned depth meets something planar and dense. Underwriters don't price folklore, they price form. The straight corridor where premiums rise is an actuarial echo of ancient standard lifts. One detail would matter later. Repeat caisson heights telegraph through time. If insurers found a hard band and satellites traced a gravity whisper on the same bearing, it's because a modular build left a modular bruise. You don't need fables to get there. You need ash, lime, timber, stone, a ridge that points the way, and a calendar that refuses to blink. The cable engineer who wouldn't let it go. He came up through drafting tables and ship noise, the kind of engineer who trusted paper before briefings. Spring 1956, a gray deck, the Strait of Sicily sulking under a light chop. Plan A was a straight lay across the corridor. Plan B arrived when the cable head kissed something flat, twice, then a third time that made the master swear and throttle back. He didn't dramatize. He taped the strip charts end to end in his cabin and circled the plateaus where the stylus had skittered over density. In the margin, he wrote one word he knew better than to send upstairs: masonry. He folded a duplicate, slid it into a manila envelope, and mailed it to his home with a coin from his pocket. The postmark was a timestamp nobody could edit. From then on, every job that grazed the Sill added a pencil line to a private atlas he kept under shirts. He called it the line, lowercase, like a habit the sea had. Bearings, dates, a thin graphite stroke darkening with each refusal. When colleagues asked why his plot started straight and then curled, he tapped the same spot and said, "It refuses there." No lectures, just a sentence that saved money. Memos came back clean. Sill deviation stayed. Planar returns softened into anomalous substrate. He let the vocabulary bend as long as the root did too. He kept the originals anyway, carbons under carbons, tucked into envelopes he mailed to himself again. By the time anyone noticed the ritual, a rubber-banded stack in his hallway outnumbered the shoes. Micro-stories piled up because life insists. Breakfast, a call, coffee slipping from his hand when a captain said, "Netters tore again, same strip." A night crossing where he stood alone, counting the beat of hull to swell and feeling the ship stiffen over a plane he could not see. A holiday when his son asked if the pencil line on the dining table was a railroad and he said, "Something like it." He was meticulous, not mystical. He copied correspondence word for word, filed deck logs by weather and swell, and underlined the same phrase on 3 separate notes, repeated refusals at planned depth. He added a quiet index, keel scuffs, net losses, dog legs. Each entry kissed the Sill's crest. When a junior asked why the self-addressed envelopes, he answered without looking up, "If they change the file, I still have the day." One night in 1958, a broker's letter crossed his desk with a sentence that burned a groove in his brain. Indemnities, mid-channel, Sill crest spike. He wrote a single instruction on a scrap and taped it into the back of the atlas under brown paper. Check Tunis Archives, shipping indemnities, 1958. He wasn't an investigator. He left a breadcrumb for someone who would be. He never said bridge, he said, route around what refuses. But when a diver sent a photo of a block with 6 sides and a poured skin, he slipped it into a sleeve with coordinates that matched his darkest pencil. He didn't show the room. He showed his wife and said, "Keep this with the letters." On his last hospital day, he asked for the atlas. He traced the graphite ridge with a thumb gone thin and smiled like a man who'd finally lined 2 edges. He pressed the Tunis note into his daughter's palm. "They priced around it. They rooted around it. Don't write around it," he said. When the boxes were packed after the funeral, the atlas sat on top, light for what it held, heavy enough to pull us to a basement room where the word spike would become a ledger, and that ledger would give the line teeth. The Tunis box, lost, found, and buried again. The atlas gave us a direction and a year, Tunis, 1958, shipping indemnities. We walked into the National Archives with a formal letter, docket numbers scraped from old port circulars, and enough optimism to survive a front desk. The clerk stamped our request and slid it into a tray that looked like a waiting room for lost causes. "Processing," she said. "Weeks." We didn't have weeks. Buildings remember in ways people forget. Down a side corridor, an assistant with ink on her fingers whispered that maritime insurance files were being rationalized. That word means boxes move, labels change, and evidence grows new names. "Look for crates marked accounts, port fees," she said. "If you find a ledger with ash on it, you're close." In the basement, we found dust, a broken fan, and crates with the wrong century stamped clean across their sides. Under the fresh tags, a ghost stamp bled through. Maritime claims, 1956-196. We worked a butter knife under a crate hinge like we were opening a stubborn memory. Inside, folders brittle enough to accuse you of a crime if you breathed too hard. Wharf slips, freight scuffs, and then a run of indemnities typed in French and Italian with coordinates like confessions. One claim didn't bother with poetry. Stone ramp, mid-sea obstruction, keel abrasion, hull sound, repaint required. Not reef, not wreck, ramp. The word sat there as if everybody already knew. Another read, trawl doors torn on hard plane, calm weather. The dates hugged the belt our underwriter bands had circled. The coordinates kissed the Sill's crest. We shot photos, copied index data to cards, and tried not to crack spines with our hands. Halfway through the stack, a photograph slid loose like a dare. A deckhand, bare-chested and grinning, held a block with 6 sides and a beveled skin that showed a poured edge. Caption, "Recovered stone mid-channel." On the back, salt smear, docket number, and a rubber stamp from a cable detour case we already knew. Hexagon, poured face. The 1955 polygonal paving sketch suddenly had a body. We logged everything and filed a formal digitization request. Then we walked our copies to a cafe with no windows. An hour later, the assistant found us with a face that said the room had grown hands. "2 documents vanished," she whispered. "They were on the cart, now they're not." In their slots, 2 immaculate folders with the same outward titles and fresh numbers, each maddeningly bland. Inside, ramp had softened into obstruction. Coordinates had blurred into mid-channel. Back downstairs, the crate had shifted 5 inches. That isn't paranoia, that's a person. The air smelled like cardboard and cologne. In the ledger we'd circled, the pencil ring around Chaussee wore a second, heavier strike-through. Someone else had recognized the word for road and killed it. The assistant said nothing, just tore a sheet from her pad and wrote slowly, "Port Syndicate copies." Port syndicates keep parallel books, union records, damaged pools, paper that doesn't answer to ministries. 3 streets away, up a stairway worn hollow, an old man at a metal desk flipped our letter, sucked his teeth, and unlocked a cabinet. "Photocopies only," he said. We paid in coins and quiet. The copies were ghosts, but ghosts talk. A marginal hand tallied stone days. Another note read, "Road visible at low swell." They didn't argue politics, they logged work. Meanwhile, our formal digitization request came back stamped, "Collection not available due to reprocessing." Reprocessing is a Latin word for erasure. We appealed. The appeal disappeared. The assistant left one more breadcrumb, taped inside a Marine Tariffs 1957 cover, 3 docket numbers and a line, "Insurer's Tunis office, microfilm, outside purge." The insurer's office smelled like chilled air and carpet. The receptionist called us by name before we introduced ourselves. "Client data is confidential," she smiled. We nodded like people who accept policy. We didn't leave. Eventually, a man with a tie loosened by the heat ushered us into a room with a reader. 10 minutes, he said. "No prints." He watched us like a cat watches a bird. The film clicked, frames spooled, hull scrapes, coordinates, pencil ghosts of the Avoidance band, margin language we'd seen in London again, treat as routing, not notice. One frame before his hand reached the switch, a memo. "Indemnities mid-channel, Sill crest, 958 spike." Spike, not rumor, a shape in money. We stood, thanked him, and walked out with nothing in our hands and everything in our heads. Back at the cafe, we wrote until our fingers cramped. Claims that called an obstruction a ramp. A hexagonal block with a poured skin. Ledger margins that tried bridge/chaussee, then retreated. 2 files that vanished and returned as their own shadows. A parallel microfilm that didn't get the purge memo. None of it said causeway in a voice a courtroom would love. All of it sang the Sill. The crate gave us a story. Industry paid for contact with something flat and hard exactly where physics draws steps. The edits gave us another. Someone cared enough to soften nouns and steal hours. We didn't catch hands, we caught choices. The assistant hugged us at the door. Hurry, she said. She meant out of the building. She also meant into the next round. Meanwhile, above our heads, satellites were learning to read gravity.